Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT ranked meta video. Our analysts are here to go through the 11.7 meta for each stage of the game. We'll be recapping the meta in terms of items, compositions, and in general how to play during the early, mid, and late game. The meta is all around well balanced with a lot of diverse options at each stage of the game. There's a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video, and to start it off, let's talk about items. As the meta hasn't changed a lot in recent patches, the priority for items remains quite similar. But there has been more of a shift in the mid-game, where late-game carries like Olaf, Tryndamere, and Kayle have fallen down in priority, while carries that spike earlier have gone up quite a bit in value. This shift is also reflected in what items are being prioritized. With that said, let's go over the beginning carousel for which components to try and grab. The top three components to look for early game are Sword, Glove, and Rod. Securing one of these early helps a lot since they're generally contested all game long. Glove still has advantages over Sword and Rod, but all three are valuable. Glove builds into the best all-around item, Hand of Justice. It's great for any damage dealer all game long, so opening the door to being able to build it early is always worth it. Other glove items aren't all that great early game, but common ones to make are Jeweled Gauntlet and Last Whisper. Jeweled Gauntlet is for ability damage builds like Major Fabled, while Last Whisper is common for auto attack focused carries like Olaf, Sivir, and Samira. Sword has multiple items it can be used for, but the number one current item to make with the sword is Guardian Angel. This item does well on so many champions that making sure to have at least one sword is important. Rod is not quite as high in value as the other two, but it is still useful since there's a lot of builds that utilize items like Jeweled Gauntlet, Hextech Gunblade, and Morellonomicon. Locket is also still a top tier early game item and one of the best that you can slam right away. Next in priority are Chain Vest, Tear, and Bow. Chain Vest covers most of your defensive items since it builds into a few key ones like GA and Locket, so grabbing one early can be an alright choice. Sunfire Cape is still one of the best early game items, though it is a bit outdated because of Morellos. Tear is basically just for Hand of Justice, but Chalice can be a strong utility item for later on in the game. Bow is used for Last Whisper and Kayle items, so it's not all that necessary to pick up early unless you're dead set on forcing Kayle. Lastly, there's Belt and Cloak, neither of which you really need to prioritize because picking them up in later carousels is quite easy to do. Overall, aim for one of the top three priority components if possible. Look to slam early power items like Locket, Hand of Justice, or Morellonomicon, otherwise save your components for later. With items covered, let's move on to each stage of the game, beginning with the early game. First up is early game leveling, which remains the same as usual. Leveling early helps boost your board strength and increases the odds of finding higher tiered units. Look to hit level 4 on either 2-1 or 2-2. From there, you can pre-level to 5 at the end of 2-3 if you're not able to make 10 gold, otherwise level on the standard time of 2-5. There are times you won't level early, either to play for a loss streak or if you're aiming to reroll for a 1-cost 3-star. The meta doesn't really favor many 1-cost carries, so the main one to consider is Tristana 3. In any case, the plan is to save your gold, don't level, and slow roll once you've hit 50. Going on a loss streak, on the other hand, is much more popular, especially because of Fortune. But we don't really recommend playing this way because giving up early health makes your mid and late game harder. Only play this style if you're comfortable with it or forced into it because of bad luck. Now, let's talk about early game champions and traits. The number one rule to keep in mind is to play your strongest board. This means it doesn't matter all that much which chosen you play or what traits you have, as the plan is to have a solid front line with a strong damage dealer behind it. Also, you don't have to be greedy with your chosen, you can buy an early one even if it's not the best, since you can sell it and find a new one relatively easy later on. That said, there are plenty of strong options to consider. In particular, it's good to gravitate towards early game boards that transition easily into the mid game. Cultist, for example, is quite strong during stage 2, but one of the strongest synergies in stage 3 with 6 cultists, so having an early board revolving around the trait can be valuable. Another trait that spikes during stage 3 is Warlord, though it's not quite as strong as Cultist during stage 2, even if you hit an early Katarina. But a chosen Garen can be a good starting point since he provides a solid front line. Keeper is another early game trait that often gets paired with Cultist. If you're lucky and find an early Kennen, you can instead look to play 4 Keeper right away. This is one of the few traits that you can stick with all game, as late game Keeper is one of the best comps. And then there's certain carries. Tristana overall is the best 1-cost damage dealer. Use her with Sharpshooters or Dragon Soul to gain an early lead. She's also one of the best item carries since you can give her practically anything. Transition out of her later on into champions like Sivir, Kennen, or Aurelion Sol, depending on what items you have. Lastly, there's Mage with either Twisted Fate or Brand as the chosen. Either way, the plan is early 5 Mage to later pivot towards Aurelion Sol. To sum up the early game, aim to play your strongest board, level at standard intervals, and don't be greedy with your chosen. Let's now move into the mid game. The mid game is actually the most important part of the game. A weak early game you can recover from, but a weak mid game is likely going to lead to a bottom 4 or a 4th place finish at best. Make it your goal to get better during this part of the game, and you'll begin to consistently place higher. To begin the mid game, you want to level to 6 on 3-2, maybe 3-3 if your board is safe enough to wait around. Either way, you need to decide whether or not you need to roll. If your early game board hasn't been doing all that well, you need to roll, or if you're close to a power spike. Sell your chosen if it's not doing well anymore and look for a new one, preferably a 2 or 3 cost champion. Much like the early game, the overall goal here is to play your strongest board, meaning you need to find a carry you can give items to and an upgraded frontline. Keep in mind this is also a good time to try and hit power spikes for traits like 6 Cultist or 6 Warlords. Try to roll until your board is strong enough, but don't dip below 10 gold or else your economy will be ruined. From here, we're just saving gold and waiting to level on 4-1 to 7. Once again, you'll want to roll here, though you may not need to if your board is strong enough from rolling earlier or if you've been high rolling. If you do roll, you'll be aiming for a more concrete mid-game composition, though it's best to avoid late-game carries like Olaf, Tryndamere, or Kayle because they don't immediately increase your board strength as 1-star units. Aurelion Sol, on the other hand, is fine as a 1-star unit. Overall, though, the plan is again the same as previous rolldowns: find a carry with a front line. Your goal during stage 4 is to try and get by with as little gold spent as possible, since you want to aim to level 8 between 4-5 and 5-3. The stronger you are, the greedier you can play. The weaker you are, the later you'll end up leveling to 8. Before we move on to the late game, let's cover some mid-game comps. In general, mid-game builds can be broken down into 2 sections, early and late. Early compositions are ones that spike during stage 3 and 4 that you can use to transition into stronger boards later. Late mid-game builds use carries like Olaf that struggle during stage 4 but spike once you've hit level 8 and can 2-star them. Whichever route you go depends a lot on how strong your board was during stage 3 and 4. Early mid-game compositions focus a lot on 3-cost carries. Sivir is great with Spirit Sharpshooter or Cultist and pivots easily into Samira. Or you can stick with Sivir with the win condition being Sivir 3. Neeko is another 3-cost unit that has a 3-star win condition, though you rarely pivot out of that composition that she's used in, which is Vanguard Mystic Fabled. Keeper is another mid-game composition that spikes during stage 3 and 4 if you have Kennen too. Kennen is the key here as he buys your board a lot of time and allows you to comfortably hit level 8 where you can either transition out of Keeper or you can stick to it by playing Xayah 2 with 6 Keeper. If you do pivot, you'll either play Slayer or Keeper. Mage is sort of in between early and late game compositions because it does so well early on because Aurelion Sol is just fine as a 1-star carry. But you do need to 2-star him at some point after you hit level 8 or else you'll start getting outscaled. Speaking of outscaled, 8 Brawler is another early mid-game option that you have, but you have to hit Shyvana 3 and Set 2 if you want to have any chance of doing well in the late game. Then there's the late mid-game compositions like Slayer, which need to 2-star their main carry, which can be either Olaf or Tryndamere. Samira is also an option, but don't rely on 2-starring her during stage 5, which is where you need to spike and power a Slayer to survive to the late game. Kayle has been struggling, but she's still viable. But to play her, you need to have perfect items for her, 2-star her, and have 4 to 6 Divine. Kayle is much harder to play than other builds, so only do it if you can safely pivot into her without losing a ton of health. Overall, there's a lot of options to choose from. Don't be afraid to transition out of one composition into another if you're presented with the option, as this can be a great way to increase your overall board strength. With that, we can move into the late game. The main goal for the late game is upgrading your existing board as much as you can, which generally means 2-starring your carry and your front line. It's also good to know your win conditions like 3-starring Neeko or hitting Samira 2. 5-cost champions are generally the best way to increase your board strength in the late game. Samira is the strongest carry in the meta and can be transitioned into from most compositions. Swain is the best frontliner, while Zilean and Lee Sin provide a lot of utility. Yone has risen in value a lot because of Shen and Adept being used most often as a frontline. And then there's Ornn. Ornn's artifacts are great to have, but you do need to add him in early to your board as his value goes down drastically the later the game goes on. Having him in long enough for 1 or 2 artifacts is ideal before selling him, unless you can 2-star him and need Ornn for frontline. The next aspect of the late game is level 9, which is obtainable but depends greatly on your board state and health. If you're cruising and winning rounds, you can easily save gold to level to 9. Otherwise, the investment is likely not worth it, and you're better off spending your gold to upgrade your board. Ultimately, the number one rule to follow here is to not lose the game with unspent gold. This means if you're about to lose, roll unless leveling to 9 is the only way to get stronger. Either way, spend your gold. And the last bit about the late game is scouting and positioning. Scouting is easy as it's a skill you should always be working on, especially late game. Positioning, on the other hand, is entirely dependent on your board and lobby you're in. All we can advise is to always be aware of any obnoxious threats like Zephyr, Shroud, and Aatrox. Otherwise, you just need to keep playing to gain experience in learning how to best position your current board in your current game. That's going to be it for today, folks. Overall, the meta is healthy and stable, which is a great send-off for Set 4 as a whole, since we're only one patch away from the end of the set. Let us know in the comment section below whether or not you're enjoying the current meta and what you're looking forward to being changed in the upcoming 11.8 patch. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.